data from the last set of APIS was 2009. Since then, a lot of things have changed, one of which is it's a completely different Department of Education now. There are many large-scale reforms that have been either passed by law and under implementation or have already been passed and been fully implemented. Before I go into the updates, I just want to clarify something that Toots was mentioning earlier about mothers needing to support children. I also want to clarify that we want both mothers and fathers to support children. So one thing is one of the suggestions was to really help parents understand how they can support children in schooling, not just the mothers but also the fathers, because one of the things that we were also realizing as we were on the field was so much of the child care was delegated to the mother, and when mothers are at work, the fathers were not really stepping up when they could. Right? So it really needs to be sort of a cultural change to get fathers more involved with the education of their children. Clarification na kasi tuturo pa ako na assignment ng anak ko mamaya. Okay. So you just heard about the findings of the report, research of which was done a few years ago. There have been many changes. And I'm pleased to be able to share with you some good news. Not all good news, but mostly good news. So there have been significant declines in general. I'll show you some figures in a little bit. In the prevalence of out-of-school children in the country, much of the decrease can be attributed to three interrelated large-scale programs that are being run by the government. First is the passage and full implementation of kindergarten law, which made formal schooling at 5 years old mandatory, meaning that the DepEd has become responsible for delivering free kindergarten education through all public elementary schools across the country. When we were doing the fieldwork for the project, this was not the case. So when you have children 5 years old, parents were not really thinking about sending them to school. Only parents who could afford to pay for kindergarten were sending their children to kindergarten. And there were some schools that had kindergarten. They were limited in capacity. Not everybody who wanted to enter their schools had the chance to enter them for free. Second is the passage and ongoing implementation of K-12, which seeks to enhance the basic education system through key reforms in curricula, teaching, and then adding another 2 years of basic education. And since you are all here, I'm assuming that everybody knows what K-12 is about to some extent. Attendant to this is the larger and growing budgetary commitment of government to basic education, which in 2015 totaled $361 billion, representing an increase of 18% in DepEd's budget from last year. So DepEd's budget has been increasing year on year for the past, I think, 4 or 5 years. Although it remains roughly the same proportion of the national budget, since the budget is increasing, the total amount available to DepEd is also increasing. And finally, the government has also expanded the Pantawid Pamilyang Filipino program dramatically, currently covering 4.3 million families. And those receiving assistance through the 4 Ps are required to send their children to school, and then the children have to attend at least 85% of school days. Together, these 3 broad programs introduced massive change in the way the Department of Education does its work, and it really does show in figures. Okay, sorry, down. In 2008, there was 3 million children out of school. By 2013, between 5 to 15 years old, this had declined in total to 1.2 million. So from 3 million in 2008, now it's 1.2 million in 2013. Among 6-year-old to 15-year-old children, wala pa yung mga, without the kindergarten age kids, there was 3,360,000 children out of school between the ages of 6 to 15. By 2011, it had declined to 1,687,000. In 2013, it stood at a little over 1 million. There are declines in both primary and secondary age children, but the sharper decline has been for those between the ages 6 to 11. So a lot of the majority of the change that we're seeing happens in the primary school age kids. An even sharper decline is apparent among 5-year-old children. So this table shows, this chart shows 5-year-old children in terms of rate of decline. The chart shows the overall out-of-school rates for 5 to 15-year-old kids, which declined from 6.7% nationally to 4.43% in 2013. Among 5-year-olds in particular, these are kindergarten-age kids, it was 16.6% in 2011, and 2 years later have to to 8.5%. Among those in primary age, 6 to 11 years old, it went down from 6.6% in 2011 to 3.6% in 2013. The drop is more modest in high school among the older kids, where, as was mentioned by Luz earlier, the problem is really the dropping out more than problems getting them in. The drop is more modest in from 8.4% to 6.9%. There are major regional differences. ARMM is still a big problem. The out-of-school children rate there is 16.7%, which is very different from the rest of the country. Others that are also large, Soc-Sargen, 7%, as well as CAR, 7%. The regions that are doing very well, 2.4% in Western Visayas and 3.5% in Calabarzon. So we still have some regional differences that we need to pay attention to, and will allow us to target particular interventions in areas where OOSC is still high. This chart shows school attendance rates of 5-year-old children by education level of the household head. By education level of the household head for those who are upper middle quintile in wealth status and those who are in the poorest quintile. So what this chart seeks to show you is here in the in the first set of bars on top, the upper middle class rates of school attendance are the upper middle class rates of school attendance in 2013. And then this was their attendance in 2008. These are children who are about kindergarten age. Among the poorest, it was this in 2013 and then this in 2008. The different color bar shows the household head level of education. So there are a few variables in play there. But you'll see that in 2008, attendance rates for the poor was not only lower than the middle class, 47 versus 82 here. So total attendance rate in 2008 for the poorest was 47.2 for the Philippines. Among the middle class, it was 82%. It is also highly unequal. So you can see the inequality when you look at the poorest. Among the poorest households, the inequalities are large. So beyond those who had household heads that went beyond secondary school, more than 70% of 5-year-old kids go to school. And then it declines sharply from there as education of the household head also declines. 72% among those who finished high school versus 21% among those who did not finish elementary. Compare this with upper middle class in 2008, where the bars are not far apart. So the comparison is this. You can see that they're highly unequal among the poor, depending on the level of education of the household head. But here, when you are wealthier, it doesn't really matter all that much how much education the household head has. When they have kids that are 5 years old, they're more likely to be in school in general. By 2013, the attendance rate for the poorest had gone up to 92% from 47%. And it's almost equitable across the level of education of the household head. They had almost caught up with those who are in the middle class. What this means is that not just that there are higher attendance rates among 5 years old in kindergarten nationally, but also that there's an equalizing effect in school attendance across income levels. This chart shows the enrollment rates for primary school on the left here. And on the left is primary school and on the right is secondary school. It looks dramatic only because the chart starts at 60%. So 60% in the both at all. That's 90%, 95%, 100%. The blue bars are for boys, the red bars are for girls, and the green bars are the totals across the Philippines. The chart starts at 60%. While the enrollment rates increased steadily between 2008 and 2013 for elementary, the same cannot really be said for secondary, so the gains have largely been in primary school. Attention now needs to be poured into increasing the low enrollment rates for those in high school age. In these levels, dropout rates are higher and much more pronounced among boys than among girls. The bi-sex disparities haven't changed, and it's a problem that really needs to be addressed. If we're going to make a dent in reducing out-of-school incidents among older children. Because the rates of dropouts and the rates of out-of-school children among older kids are so disparate by boys and girls. We really need to start paying attention to the gender issues. So the challenge ahead is in securing higher retention rates now, particularly in high school and particularly among boys. There were 48 recommendations made that was flashed on the screen earlier. All the recommendations fall under general areas of making early education more accessible to get younger kids to school early, because we had found back in 2010 that a lot of the OOSC were really young kids who people felt were not ready to go to school. Improving curriculum and teaching to less rote-centered styles to learner-centeredness, and in the process perhaps addressing bi-sex disparities in learning outcomes. Improving management and operations to enable performance-based evaluations and incentive programs for schools, managers, and teachers. And evaluating and monitoring alternative delivery mechanisms and alternative learning systems. On early education, many of the recommendations of the 48 that were made, many of the recommendations have already been addressed largely by universal kindergarten. The rollout of universal kindergarten meant the DepEd had to hire teachers, they expanded infrastructure, and they crafted a curriculum that would prepare children for entry into first grade. We saw the declines in the OOSC rates among 5-year-old children, and so much of the recommendations have already been addressed. What remains is getting the 3 to 4-year-old children into some form of early education program, and this becomes the purview now of the SWD along with LGUs who provide that kind of early education program. The recommendations that pertain to quality were proposed centering on curricula, teaching, and other pedagogical issues. Most of these have been, at least in theory, because the full rollout of K-12 is not yet here, are in theory addressed in K-12. It's too early to tell if the curricular revisions and the learner-centered approaches written into the implementation of K-12 will bear fruit. The monitoring and evaluation over the next few years is important to not just test whether the reforms will produce the gains it's designed to produce, but also to make changes or adaptations in implementation if necessary when monitoring results find any issues, bottlenecks, or constraints. The recommendations that haven't been addressed, and there are no apparent specific programs to address these particular issues, are the ones aimed at gaining gender parity in the distribution of outcomes in schools. The bi-sex differences nationally are probably sharper now than they were in 2008 because these are typically worse among older kids when they enter high school, and now they comprise a large portion of the OOSC that remains. The 4-piece program can make a dent in this by reducing the economic imperative among poor families to put their children to work as soon as they're old enough to be making money. However, this needs to be complemented by programs from the education system that will look at the nature of the differences that are school-based, and the causes that may be school-based, and then what the department can do to address them. A number of recommendations were also made in relation to strengthening management and operations in the schools, and these are the issues that you don't read in the news very often. These are internal efficiencies that are equally important, I would say, and that also important but not often covered. Okay. Not often covered in the media. And there were recommendations pertaining to building stronger accountability mechanisms through performance monitoring. These were made in light of findings that while in theory many of the school-based management principles, such as drilling down funds, MOE to schools, were being practiced, there were operational bottlenecks that needed attention. This was 2010. Many changes have been institutionalized in the way the department operates. For instance, MOE are now fully drilled down and in control of school heads. Larger schools have been given assistance in capacity building to help them cope with administrative burdens of handling budgets. And data gathering from schools through the Basic Information System, or the BEIS, has been put online, making the flow of planning and logistical arrangements now faster. Much more work remains in building a stronger performance monitoring system. For example, the mapping and tracking of OOSC and those in danger of dropping out would no longer require the cooperation of LGUs if the DepEd is able to sustain and grow the learning information system, which is now in its early stages. That is tracking of children on a child-by-child basis, so that we can see if children are dropping out from one school, turning up in another school, dropping out, transferring. Kasi walang tracking. Right now, there's no tracking, but kids move from school to school. And since there's no database or information management system that's at the DepEd level that looks at individual students, it's difficult to track. So there's a lot of cooperation that needs to happen right now between LGUs and the local DepEd to identify kids who are no longer in school. Most importantly, this kind of tracking will provide more detailed data about student performance through the tracking of grades and absences, which in turn can help the system identify students that are at risk of dropping out before they drop out. So what remains? The details of all the recommendations are in the epilogue chapter of the report, but in summary, there clearly have been large gains in reducing the OOSC prevalence in the Philippines. And moving forward, the remaining challenges will have to be addressed in parallel with the K-12 implementation. More attention must be paid to the underperformance of boys and in addressing the dropout rates, particularly among older children. All this will be enabled by a real performance-based system supported by strong data capture, storage, management, and open data policies in practice. For both input and outcomes data, while the DepEd has been openly sharing its input data, allowing researchers such as ourselves to examine bottlenecks and internal DepEd constituencies, are able to see how they are faring compared to others, the outcomes data are not as openly shared. It's not available at the school-based level. In particular, testing data and results at the school level are not connected to input data, and it's something that will really give us specific analytical goals that we can look at to see which inputs produce outcomes if we have the testing data. So all the data are there, it's a matter of being able to connect them. And then the storage and the management systems and making them available is also a large challenge, but something that can provide large gains. It's an investment. It can provide large gains in a lot of the things that DepEd's already done. The government's decision to increase the budget of the DepEd, coupled with large investments in CCT as part of its overall strategy of prioritizing social services, is clearly paying off with growing evidence of improved participation in primary education. In both sides and as a proportion of the budget, these human resource investments can and should continue and be deepened so that no one, whether poor or non-poor, male or female, is left behind in educational attainments as the country pursues a path of sustained growth, prosperity, and development. Thank you very much.